This is a copy of the Bible study that will be led at Northfield Evangelical Church on Thursday, the 12th of September. It's based on Colossians chapter 1, verses 13 to 23. It's really important you read those verses first, and there's a link below them so you can do that. Imagine you are given a get well soon card to sign for somebody that you know. Get well soon. You might write a get well soon card. You might sign a get well soon card to someone who's had their appendix removed. Maybe you'd write a get well soon card to somebody who's had their kidney removed, or to someone who's had their toe amputated, or even to someone who's had their arm removed. But would you sign a get well soon card to someone who'd been decapitated, who'd had their head chopped off? Would you say to them, I hope you get well soon? None of us would sign a get well soon card for someone who's been beheaded, because when there is no head, there is no life. When there is no head, the rest of the body has no future. Keep this in mind as I read again the beginning of verse 18. And he, Jesus Christ, is the head of the body. Paul often used the image of the body when describing the church. And when he uses this image, he often describes Christ as the head. You could debate what Paul means exactly, but one thing is clear. Without the head, there is no body. Without Christ, there is no church. Even if a building with a spire has people meeting together to talk about God, including hymns about God, teaching about God, and testimonies of people's experiences of God, even if it has all those things, if there is no Christ, then that body of people is not a church. But why? Why is Christ so essential to the life of the Christian church? Why could we not simply omit him? Well, imagine that we're turning the H.G. Wells novel, The Invisible Man, into a film. Every time the Invisible Man appears on screen, the audience aren't going to be able to see him. How are we going to help the audience see the Invisible Man? Well, we could do it through actions. We could have the Invisible Man do something, such as pick up a book. We could have the Invisible Man could have a voice, and so we could have the Invisible Man speak. We could have an outline of the Invisible Man. We could wrap the Invisible Man's faces in bandages, or dress him in clothes, or throw wet cement at him. This would give us an outline of the Invisible Man. Now in verse 15, God is described as invisible. Whilst this may describe God's physical form, I think the word invisible is mainly used to describe how we cannot understand God, or know God, or comprehend God, unless he reveals himself to us, unless he makes his invisible character and nature visible. The ways that the invisible God revealed himself in the Old Testament included actions. We can know something of what God is like from the things that he did. From the flood, we know that God is the judge of all mankind. From the exodus from Egypt, we know that God is the saviour of his people. From God providing manna in the wilderness, we know that God is the provider. We can know what God is like through his actions. We can know what God is like through an outline. We can know something of what God is like through the human figures that he used. Moses interceded for the Israelites, which shows God is a God of mercy towards sinners. God used David to defeat Goliath, which shows God's desire to save his people from their enemies. God used Elijah and Elisha to show his justice and his grace. We can know something of what God is like through his actions and through the human figures that God used. Voice. We can know something of what God is like via his words. The law, transcribed by Moses, shows us God's moral character. The prophets told how God felt about various situations. So if we know through the Old Testament what God is like, through his voice, through his outline, through his actions, then why do we need Jesus? Why is Old Testament revelation not sufficient in and of itself? Well, imagine 100 people watch our film, The Invisible Man. They all watch exactly the same scenes. They watch the scene where the invisible man goes shopping and picks an item off the shelf. They watch a scene where the invisible man puts on clothes. They watch a scene where the invisible man sits down and has a chat with his victim. Now, after watching the film, all 100 people are asked to draw a picture of the invisible man. How many different pictures would we have? And why? None of these 100 people saw the invisible man fully. And so we'd have 100 different pictures of the invisible man. Each person would substitute what they couldn't see with their own personal interpretation. A personal interpretation that could be near accurate, or it could be totally wrong. In much the same way, without Christ, our understanding of God might be somewhat accurate, but it will be mixed in with our own personal thoughts, our own personal opinion, and our own personal preferences. Thankfully, Jesus shows us God fully. The Son is the image of the invisible God. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. You know, even if a building has a spire, and as people meet together to talk about God, if their understanding of God is not based on Christ, then their understanding of God might be highly subjective and potentially wrong. But if our understanding of God is based on his Son, the Son who is the image of the invisible God, whose God fullness dwells in, if our understanding of God is based on Jesus, then we understand God fully and truly. We need to remember this, because us humans have the tendency to be overconfident in what we think we know. Children think they know better than their parents. University graduates think they know everything after reading a single textbook. When a man fails at fixing something in public, there will be 10 men who volunteer to show them how it's done. I found that the same applies to me as a Christian, and to Christians probably in general. We can often be overconfident that we think we know what God is like. We assume that God thinks like us and shares our opinions and is 100% behind the things that we want for ourselves. Verse 16 reminds us to have a healthy degree of humility when it comes to what we think we know. It says, "For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible." When this was written, maybe 0.01% of the universe was visible to the Colossians. Unseen solar systems and galaxies, black holes, supernovas, they didn't see or understand any of these things. These things were invisible to them. In fact, so much of the universe is still invisible to us. Invisible in the sense that we cannot see it, or invisible in the sense that we cannot understand it. We only see the parts of the universe that light has had the time to arrive from. And though we have theories such as the theory of relativity and the theory of quantum mechanics, To help explain some of what we see, physicists will actually agree that we don't understand the universe at all. In fact, some of our theories, the theory of quantum mechanics and the theory of general relativity, they actually say contradictory things. There is so much about the universe we don't understand. And we need to display the same humility when it comes to God. We can only understand what God has revealed. And if Christ is the invisible God made visible, we have to accept whatever we learn about God through Him. And when we base our understanding of God on Christ, on the truth, the church thrives in all the right ways. I'm going to read Colossians 2 verses 6 to 9 now as well. Oops, sorry. In fact, I'm going to read Colossians 1 verses 6 to 9. No, I'm not. Sorry, I'm losing my place. Going to read Colossians chapter 1 verses 15 to 22. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authority. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. In verses 15 to 22, the camera is very much directed on Jesus. Jesus is very much the main character in all of creation. Everything else is a mere extra, no matter how big in other ways. And if you think about, the camera is very much focused on Jesus. And if you've ever seen a film, you might realise that the angle that the camera is pointed says a lot. If the camera in a film is orientated to look up at a character, what might that say? It says they're big or important, or they are in power. If a camera looks down on a character, it is saying they are vulnerable to a big oppressor, or they are small. Notice in verse 16 that thrones, powers, rulers and authorities are mentioned. Normally the camera would be looking up at somebody sat on a throne. But in verses 16, the thrones, the powers, the rulers and authorities are all looking up to Jesus. What does this say about Jesus? It is saying he is Lord of all. He has authority over all things. We must remember that Christ is also the head of the church. He is its Lord. He has authority over all things. Surely he should have authority over it. And if a church ignores the authority and lordship of Jesus, it will mean the death of a church. Now clearly, Paul clearly felt he had to big up the insignificance of Jesus to the Colossians. He had to do this because some false teachers claimed to have received some additional revelation that they treat as authoritative. You had to listen to their teaching to make progress in the Christian faith. Paul reminds them and us that we all have all the revelation we need in Jesus. Submit to him and you can't go wrong. Abandon Jesus and you'll go astray. If a church acknowledges Christ as Lord and its Master, what difference does that make? If a church doesn't acknowledge Christ as Lord and Master, what difference might that make? Well, churches are to submit to Christ's authority. They are to submit to his teaching. They are to submit to his intentions for what a church should be. They are to submit to his purposes for that church. The church is not a social club where the members decide what they'd like to do each month. The church is the body for which Christ is the head, and the head always sets the agenda. Not only is the camera focused on Jesus, but the camera focuses in on one specific scene in Jesus' life. It says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. I want you now to think, if Christ's cross, if Christ's death for sinners wasn't the main thing in the life of a church, what impact might it have? What else might they make the main thing? Or, so let's have a think. If the death and resurrection of Christ are not the front and centre in the life of the church wouldn't be a church, at least according to God's definition. For it is only through Christ's death that it is possible to know God and be counted as one of his people. If the death and resurrection of Christ are not front and centre, the church might be more about offering people moral education than offering helpless sinners salvation. Church life becomes more about beating people up for their moral failings and teaching them to try harder than about offering lost people the hope that they need. If Christ's death and resurrection are not front and centre, a church would lack love for God. For love for God only comes from seeing his love for us. Church life, instead of being about love, becomes more about doing our duty than about doing something out of desire and for love. And a church in which Christ's death is not front and centre, it's easy for pride to grow. The Christians are no more than good people who follow the teachings of a good man. If Christ's death is not front and centre, Jesus' mission was simply to make the world a better place, not save people for eternity. And so likewise, the church's central mission should be to make the world a better place through social work type activities. And as a result, speaking to people about their eternal need would get ignored. If Christ's cross is not front and centre, suffering has no place in the life of a Christian, for Jesus only ever relieved suffering. This might lead to a prosperity gospel type message. God's purpose is all about making your life easier than helping you to live the good life now. Whereas if the cross is at the front and centre of the life of the church, then it establishes a pattern, the pattern of suffering now, followed by glory later. It sets the pattern of serving others, not serving ourselves. Remember, when Christ is the head of the church thrives. But when there is no head, there is no life, and the rest of the body has no future. Just think about it. Think of all the reasons that a church has died, why it has had no future. Think of all the reasons. Churches close because of pride. The remedy for this is to remember that Christ died for sinners like you and me. Churches close because of a lack of love. Church-going has become a mere formality, or there's a lack of love between the church members. The remedy for this is remembering God's love for us, shown through the death of Jesus for sinners. Churches close because of division. The remedy to this may well be remembering our shared faith in Christ's death and resurrection. The thing that unites us is bigger than that which divides us. Churches close because they abandon biblical faith. The remedy to this is remembering Christ's lordship. Churches close because of the moral failures of their leaders. The remedy to this is remembering Christ's lordship of our lives and a willingness to obey him as Lord. Churches close when people realize that the prosperity gospel doesn't deliver. When suffering comes, their thin faith cannot make sense of it. And when the prosperity gospel doesn't deliver what it promises, they grow disillusioned. Churches close because they fail to reach out to others with the gospel. The remedy to this is remembering the purpose for which God sent Christ into the world, to reach out and to save the lost. We see that desire in verse 19 and 20. God's and Christ's desire to reconcile the world to himself. Despite all that it would involve, God was pleased to do all that was needed to reconcile the world to himself. God wasn't guilt-tripped into it, nor did he do it dragging his feet, which, if I'm honest, are often my only motivations for sharing the gospel. But God wasn't guilt-tripped into it. He didn't do it dragging his feet. A love for people caused Jesus to count every sacrifice a pleasure. Likewise, the first step to evangelism is nurturing a heart for people. Also, note the wording of these verses. And through Christ to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven. Now imagine you're staying at a hotel that serves a full English breakfast every morning. Every day, piles and piles of sausages, bacon, eggs and baked beans are on display. You tell somebody you had a full English. They ask if you had everything. Do they mean, did you eat all 100 sausages, all 200 rashers of bacon, and all 1,000 baked beans that were on display? Or do they mean, did you help yourself to at least one of all the different possibilities? In much the same way, the statement that through Christ God will reconcile to himself all things, it does not mean that every single person will come to faith in Christ. It rather means that God has no prejudice. He loves the full earth, even more than we love a full English. He desires to save people from every culture, every language, every race, every nation, and every religion. He will save people from every culture, every language, every race, every nation, every religion. And if God has no prejudice, then neither should we. If God is willing to reach out to all, reaching out to all should be a priority for us too. It cost God something to reconcile all things. He made peace through Christ's blood shed on the cross. It wasn't easy, it wasn't pain-free. It involved effort and sacrifice. And therefore our efforts to reach others should involve the same. It won't be easy. It won't be pain-free. It will involve effort and sacrifice on behalf of us.